Before we get down to business today, there are two things I'd like to talk about. First, I'd like to reiterate my apology for what you must see as a total disappearance. As I said in the email that I sent to you, it's not that I ran away. I just came down with what they have diagnosed as a sinus infection, which makes it hard to do much of anything, because if I walk 20 feet, I have to stop and rest for 10 minutes. And as you can tell, my voice is not what it should be. I know I'm not speaking loudly enough, and I'm sort of finding it hard to keep track of things from time to time. Therefore, I'm asking your indulgence today, and I'll just leave it at that. Please cut me some slack, and I'll be better next week. A second thing is, I just have to say this. I think I picked up this sinus infection at a wrestling tournament that my grandson was in, and I'll keep it short. Let's just say he won his division. He's a middle schooler. He won the middle school division. I asked the coach what I could say about his victories without being untrue or false, and the coach said, you could say that your grandson is a middle school national champion. Not the middle school national champion, but a middle school national champion. And so I just know you don't care about that particularly, but I'm really proud and I can't help boasting. So thank you for not turning off the sound. The third thing I'd like to do is talk about last night's election. Now, I know you were glued to your TV sets and you have been reading the newspapers sedulously every day for weeks now because you wanted to figure out what was going to happen in the state of Virginia. And because you've been on this, you know that the Democrats won last night by quite a substantial majority. The interesting thing about this is just a couple of takeaways. And I hope, by the way, kidding aside, that you might go back or just look at the newspaper today or Google Virginia elections and just spend half an hour or an hour looking at some of the analyses and see what you find. The Republican who was running was a man named Ed Gillespie, who was kind of Mr. Republican. He was a very close advisor to George Bush. He was a former chair of the Republican National Committee. He was a K Street lobbyist. He's about as what's the word I'm looking for? He was about as Washington mainline Republican as it's possible to be. And it's interesting that in his campaign, he found that to be a liability. And he was attacked on that from within his own party, from the other fringes of the Republican Party. And so he tried to walk a very, very narrow path, identifying himself with Donald Trump, while at the same time not actually being seen at all with him in public. And Trump actually made no appearances or gave no speeches on his behalf. The point I'm trying to make is, and this goes back to presidents and things we've said about, things we're going to say about elections and things we've said about congressmen, all of those kinds of things that we've talked about. Mood, political mood. He sensed correctly a shift in the political mood of this country, and he tried to play to it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just good sense. I would argue that he misjudged the state of the mood of the people of Virginia. He did a Trump-like campaign. He talked about immigration. He talked about statues. He talked about medical care. He did all of these things. And the fact of the matter is, as a former resident of Fairfax County, Virginia, Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is full of immigrants. The people who live there are highly educated. Many of them, Northern Virginia is known to be a bedroom for the Pentagon and the Department of Defense. That's what it was for me. And he talked the wrong way. He completely misjudged, I think, the nature of his electorate, and he lost decisively. And I can't resist saying that when Trump was asked, well, Trump wasn't asked about it. Trump is almost never asked about anything. He just tells us. And Trump's response was, well, he wasn't enough like me. He should have been more like me. If he had been more like me, he would have won. I'm sorry, I think that's patent nonsense. It's just nonsense. And I would be prepared to defend that. Now, I'm not here to do a number on Donald Trump or on the election in Virginia, but I am going to take this opportunity to talk about how political mood is a deep and important factor in what happens here during our elections and how it impacts the public decision-making at almost every level. Take that to heart. Now, what do you think this portends? What do you think this means for future elections? It's worth noting that in New Jersey, the Democrats won as well. In Washington State, the legislature went Democratic for the first time in a while. In Maine, they voted to extend Obamacare. So on the one hand, the Congress is all tied in a knot trying to do something with Obamacare, get rid of it, but here's a state not known for its liberalism saying, we want more of this. We want to get this expanded and working. All of this should tell us a great deal about the mood in the country at the time. And that's just what I'm trying to point out in the unlikely event that you missed it. As you read and as you talk, please keep that in your minds and keep that in your hearts. And critique yourselves. We should all do that. About, are we the creatures of this mood? Are we the creators of this mood? Or are we the controllers of this mood? And I would just point that out and ask you to consider it. Okay, now we can continue our discussion of the judiciary, if it's okay with you. Let's begin. The last time we talked, I think I made some points about the political nature and the political role of the judiciary and how important that political role is. Particularly so, given what I've just said about political mood and the way the general feeling of things influences the things that can influence things that happen. What I'm really talking about here is another way of discussing what you've heard me mention many times, identity politics. Identity politics. You know, it's one thing to say about a candidate, what's this guy going to do for me? That's the normal model that is the model of politics that we have grown up with, pretty much all of us. The question that's asked now is, what is this guy going to do for me and other people like me? The question is, what's he going to do for us? Because we define ourselves, as we never have before, as members of a political group. Hence, we talk about identity politics. So, continuing with our discussion of the political nature of the judicial branch, let us be keenly aware of the importance of identity politics in all of this. I have said that the court is, in fact, a political actor. And this is so in three senses. First, the court makes decisions that affect other people. The court exercises power in a public way. That is one definition of politics. The court determines who's going to do what and who should do what and what the reasons should be. This is not a dictatorship. It occurs within a constitutional context. But when all is said and done, the court is exercising power. It's forcing people to do what they may not want to do in some cases. So that's political. Secondly, and this is where the notion of identity politics becomes very, very important. Politics is political in the sense that a judicial decision consists of the acting out of the judge's own political preferences and ideologies. This is not to say that justices and judges aren't fair. This is not to say that they aren't objective. This is not to say that justices, the courts are stacked against because of what judges believe. Sometimes that appears to be true, but not always, and not even most of the time, just some of the time. But the point that must be taken is that all judges have preconceived ideas about what is and what isn't good and bad. They're supposed to. That's why they went to college. That's why they went to law school. That's why all of us go to college, or who go to college to do it. We develop ideas, a philosophy of life, a view of things. All judges have that. So that's political. And the third thing in which the actions of the judiciary tend to be political is that they are, as I said, affected by political mood. So we've talked about three ways in which what happens with the judiciary is influenced by politics, and indeed is by its very nature political. And we've talked about the importance of political mood in all of this. Let's try to illustrate this in a solid and concrete way so that you can fix it in your own minds. If you look at page 384 in your text, there's a chart which shows how long it takes between the time an individual is nominated for a position as a district court judge, an appellate court judge, or Supreme Court justice, and the actual confirmation. And what that chart tells you is that as time has passed in the last 20 years, the amount of time that it takes from nomination to confirmation or non-confirmation has increased. The sole reason for this has nothing to do with any kind of discussion about the candidate's abilities, because most 99% of the candidates who are nominated are vetted and all have ratings of are all rated by their professional associates and colleagues as being competent for the positions they are nominated to fill. That leaves us with political motivations. Basically, liberals don't want conservatives to be judges. And conservatives surely do not want liberals to be judges. Never mind what a liberal conservative means, but I think you get the point. Politics is playing an extremely important role here. So, the Democrats delayed consideration of 39 of George Bush's nominations between 2001 and 2009. How did they do this? Back to our old friend, the filibuster. They just keep talking and talking and talking. And they will say, actually, they don't have to keep talking anymore. If a Democrat says, I move for a vote, All one of them has to do is say, I object, and that's that. The only way to end a filibuster is by invoking cloture. Remember cloture? C-L-O-T-U-R-E? Closure. But we political scientists like to say cloture. I don't know why. Just let us have our moment, okay? We have to invoke cloture. So, the Democrats filibustered 39 of President George W. Bush's nominees. Then, you'll be surprised to know, the Republicans didn't say, well, we're going to be the good guys in this. We're not going to be like those bad Democrats. They turned around and did more or less exactly the same thing to Barack Obama's, President Obama's nominations. For 16 years, actually, for 24 years, the process by which our judges are selected and put in place has been deeply affected by the political composition of the House and the Senate. Yes, the House and the Senate, but particularly the Senate. Okay? So, in that sense, we can see that judicial appointments are extremely political and extremely related to the mood of the moment. And, oops, see, my hearing aids just powered off, and I don't know what to do. Actually, it's good, because if I can't hear my own voice, I feel a lot better about things. I know you feel that way too sometimes. Anyhow, I was saying that this illustrates that the appointment of justices and judges to federal positions, to the federal benches, is highly, highly politicized. Now, a term you need to know. When the Democrats were putting it to the Republicans, can I put it this way? Can I say when the Democrats were screwing the Republicans? You're not going to report me to the office and say I used a bad word, I hope. When the Democrats were doing their thing, pardon me, when the Democrats were exercising their constitutional rights, the Republicans floated the idea of preventing or giving up the filibustering of judicial nominees. The Democrats said, if you do this, if you stop the filibuster, then we will essentially close down the Senate. Now, how can they close down the Senate? You should know that because we've talked about that. They've got all kinds of procedures they can use to delay. They can not show up for meetings. They can do a wide range of things. This threat to close down the Senate in response to an attempt to end the filibuster on judicial nominations is what we know as the nuclear option. Okay? If the Democrats invoke the nuclear option, they can do that. Republicans can invoke the nuclear option. And this could be very bad. There was a group of senators known as the Gang of 14, Republicans and Democrats, who, thank heaven, said this was just disgraceful and not good at all. And they worked out a compromise, which actually held for a while. But then it fell apart. the Democrats invoked the nuclear option, and where it stands, but they got out of it by finding yet another compromise. They agreed that there would be no filibustering of people of candidates for appellate positions or for district judge positions, but there would still be filibustering at the Supreme Court level. So that's where we are. The appointment of judges to Supreme Court, justices to the Supreme Court, judges for appellate courts, and judges for district courts, I would submit to you is a political crapshoot. I probably have overstated that a little bit, and given my present physical state, I don't have a whole lot of patience, much patience as I should, so we'll allow for that, please. But I think it's a political crapshoot, and we never know what the end result is going to be. So, I guess what I've said to you, the things pretty much that I want to say today. Well, there are a couple other things, but I want to leave you, I hope I have made the point that the judicial branch, that the judicial branch is influenced by political mood. Political mood is increasingly the result of identity politics. That is a concrete example of how identity politics affects national policy. Okay? Identity politics affects appointments, which affect judgments. If we have a different kind of politics, we don't have identity politics, then we have a different set of expectations for what the appointments might be, and the end results would be different. Now, I hope that you see that three-way connection. So this raises another very, very important question. We are told that the Senate must advise and consent on these appointments. All right, this is something else that the founders never really addressed. Exactly what are the limits of, or what is the definition of, and what are the limits of advise and consent? What does it mean? Now, today, advise and consent seems to be much more of an issue than it was 50 years ago. And by the way, what I'm talking about, I've been talking about the judicial branch. I didn't mention that what happens to nominations to the judicial branch also concerns ambassadors and a whole array of other officials whose appointments require senatorial affirmation, advise and consent. So it's a bigger problem than just judges. But the major portion of this, of course, is judges. So, I'm asking you to consider for yourselves what is, in your mind, the proper definition and the limits of advise and consent. Your thoughts are worth every bit as much and are every bit as valid as the thoughts, certainly my thoughts, or any pundit or any lawyer anywhere else. You know enough about the Constitution. You know enough about what the founders had in mind. What would your critique of this be? Now, there are some other details that I think I'm probably just going to let you dig out of the text yourselves. The question of how do you get to the Supreme Court? I'll just say a little bit about it. Suppose, can you just say, pick up a phone, find a lawyer, and say, I want to go to the Supreme Court? No, you can't really do that. Your lawyer must be certified to practice before the Supreme Court. That means she must have must be members of the bar, having been so for a long time, and have the recommendation of colleagues and so on and so forth. My ex-brother-in-law, may he rest in peace, I'm proud to say, presented a brief before the Supreme Court. And we were all excited. My wife bought him a new tie. And I was running around the office saying, hey, my brother-in-law is going to go to address the Supreme Court today, doing all of those kinds of things. Well, he was there, but they never actually asked him a question. So he was a bit disappointed. But it was sort of an inside look at how you prepare. So anyway, just remember this. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction in just a couple of areas. What those areas are, you'll find in Article 3 of the Constitution. It has appellate jurisdiction. The Supreme Court is a court of appeals. Virtually 99.9% of its business concerns an appeal from somebody who went to a lower court and was not satisfied or felt that they did not receive justice in that lower court, and they ask that. So, when we talk about the Supreme Court, we are really asking for we're really talking about the notion of a writ, W-R-I-T, of certiorari, C-E-R-T-I-O, R-A-R-I. Let me do it again. C-E-R-T-I-O-R-A-R-I, certiorari. I can't pronounce it exactly right, but write it out and you'll see what it means. That means you petition the court to issue a writ of certiorari. That means you have to tell them why you think you are entitled to their time, and they're looking at your particular problem, at your time. So they get this petition. What happens next? There are three things that have to be dealt with. What we call collusion. There has to be a major difference between the parties involved in the case. They can't have too much in common, because then it's really not a decision, is it? It could be a ploy, whatever. So the justices have to look and see, is collusion involved here? You have to have standing. Remember I made a joke about standing a long time ago? And I talked about how, I really can't go into the Supreme Court and ask that they do away with Moodle, because I have no standing to do away with Moodle. I may have been hurt by Moodle, but that's my problem, not Moodle's. And it's and it may be your problem, but it's not Moodle's problem. So we don't have we don't have standing to deal with Moodle. And the third point is mootness, M-O-O-T-N-E-S-S, mootness. Mootness simply means relevant or not. Is it still an issue? I don't think anybody is going to say, go into court and raise a case about the validity of 24-inch as opposed to 18-inch bicycle wheels, for example. We wouldn't do that. The court would simply say, that's moot. I picked a ridiculous example, but I hope it illustrates the point. Now, this is the last thing that I want to get into. Who sets the agenda for the court? How does the court decide what its docket is going to be? Well, the Chief Justice makes that decision. But not entirely. And this is the last point I want to make. Every justice, every judge, every federal judge has a number of clerks, at least one, in many cases 3 to 5, depending on how busy the court is. I don't know how many clerks each Supreme Court justice has. I think it's like 4. Now, these clerks are out of the best law schools in the country, or at least the most famous law schools in the country. It's worth mentioning, everybody on the present court is a graduate either of Harvard or Yale. Now that should tell us something, okay? And I'm willing to bet that most of the clerks for Supreme Court justices are from similar schools. And that raises a point I want to come to in just a minute. The clerks meet together as a group, and they screen the requests for writs of certiorari. And they give it a fairly careful scrub. The criteria they use are if the court hears this decision, what potential impact could it have could it result in changes in precedent? Could it cause the court to reject the notion of stare decisis? Remember that? Could it cause them to do that? Could it be? And if it does, there's a problem. Because if the court is going to reject stare decisis, it jolly well better have a good reason to do it. And they jolly well better be able to explain it to everyone's, because that's a big deal. A second criterion they use is how's it going to play? Is it a political minefield? And they feel an obligation to protect their justices. Every couple of years, all the clerks who've ever worked for a particular justice who are still alive get together, usually at the invitation of the justice, and they have a weekend party at the justice's home. They all have homes in Maine or, places like that. And they have when I say party, I don't mean a bad party. They get together with their wives and children and all of that. My point is that the clerks of the court are a highly selective, I would even say highly inbred. What else can I say about them? Selective, inbred, and basically unresponsible elite. Now, remember when we talked about congressional staff? And I said pretty much the same thing. The difference between the two elites is that the congressional staff elite is drawn from a much wider range of individuals. The Supreme Court and the federal court system elite is drawn from a much narrower range of people. So you will find, for the most part, that the clerks are extremely powerful because, one, they are demonstrably exceedingly intelligent. They are people who've been first or second in all of their classes, and maybe even more. They are people who are politically connected. They know the games of politics. And third, they are politically sensitive, and that is in fact their job. So, what can we say about the judicial branch? It's full of a lot of really, really smart people. It's full of a lot of, I think, honestly, palpably sincere people who really want to do the right thing. It's full of people who are political animals because they have the security of life tenure in the federal system. They don't have to be as responsive to political tendencies or political currents as their counterparts in the Congress, in the House, and in the Senate, or even in the bureaucracy, because they're insulated. Further, there is a kind of myth about the objective judge, the man who stands above politics and does all of those things. And there's something to that. But what I want you to take away from this, please, is something you're probably bored to tears with it, and this is the last time I'm going to say it today anyway. You know, what we are dealing with is people who are in a position which is defined by the Constitution. They work under certain rules. That does not isolate them from social, economic, political currents that exist in society. Probably less so than senators and congressmen. Probably less so even than bureaucrats. But still, the judicial branch is an active and aggressive participant in the overall political process. Thanks. I'll see you next time.